Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Sathnam Sanghera, who is a journalist for The Times of London and also the author of a bunch of books. Most recent book is called Empireworld, How British Imperialism Shaped the Globe, which is, I guess, a companion or a sequel to Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. Also the author of some memoirs, The Boy with the Top Knot, and Marriage Material, which I don't have with me. And, you know, Sathnam, I think that although you're a journalist and have been a journalist for a long time and a memoirist, you've become something of an historian. I mean, these books are really historical works which discuss the past, but more importantly, discuss our view of the past through the present. And so I was wondering, I mean, first of all, welcome, Sathnam. I'm glad you could make it. But I guess the first question I'd ask you is, you know, did your transition to becoming an historian, was this intentional or accidental? Did you find it important for you to understand the past in order to make sense of your present in England at the moment?
I think it was totally accidental, to be honest. I have a background not dissimilar to yours professionally, in that I was a business journalist and on the Financial Times. And my job there, the way I saw it, was to explain very difficult things like hedge funds in the clearest, most humorous way I could. And I see the work I'm doing now as being an extension of that, because British imperial history is very difficult in many different ways. But I find the challenge of trying to explain it in a kind of acceptable, neutral, non-culture war kind of way very appealing. So I think that's how I ended up in history. But I guess it is a bit of a surprise that I'm now an historian, and I am now officially a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. So, you know, that's a massive surprise to me.
Well, you also mentioned that when you were at the FT and covering things like hedge funds, you never got any racist emails. And then as soon as you started covering topics related to imperialism, then all of a sudden you started getting a whole bunch of these. I mean, it seems like, England doesn't quite know what to do with its past. I think there was a quote from H.G. Wells in one of your books where he said that 19 out of 20 English people of the lower and middle classes know about as much about the empire as they do about Argentina or the Italian Renaissance. And to me, that's super hard to believe, right? Because, you know, I remember growing up and there were these maps, right, that were all colored pink. They were legacy maps. They were older maps. But, I always thought that was at the center of what English kids learned in school.
Yeah, no, it's not.
You found that, no, they didn't really learn anything about the empire.
And I guess, you know,
even the triumphalist story was not something that was really part of their education.
They learn bits, but it's all, you know, a lot of myth making. But H.G. Wells then was talking about British people at the height of empire. And even then, he was arguing they didn't have much sense of the biggest empire in human history. I think there's all sorts of reasons for that. And one of the main reasons is that we're an island. So our empire happened abroad. So we could largely forget that it was there. And when it was over in very controversial circumstances, we very definitely could act like it never happened. And we came up with this idea of the Commonwealth, which kind of doubly helped us forget that we were ever involved in the empire. And so, yeah, it's quite an odd thing that we don't teach the thing that probably is the biggest thing we ever did as a nation.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like now, at least maybe belatedly, it's becoming a part of the education of a typical English school kid. Is that right? I remember growing up as a kid, and I'm kind of old, but I went to school in the 70s. We had, as part of our curriculum, discussions of slavery. And this was integral to our education and has been in the U.S. for a long time. Not that there isn't tons of controversy, but it has been a part of our education. Is that starting to become true in England?
It's changing. Actually, the odd thing is, I did get educated about slavery, but we were basically taught that it was an American phenomenon. I mean, the British involvement in, the 12 million people sent across the Atlantic to be enslaved. We sent 3 million, or more than 3 million of them. That was not mentioned. It was seen also racism. Is pretty much discussed, I would say, even now in the media, as pretty much American phenomenon. It's not something that we beat the evil racist Germans. How could we be racist? We have Rishi Sunak Prime Minister, or we did until a couple of weeks ago. How can we be racist? So we've always had this complete bizarre detachment from the history. And also, it's not, as well as not being reflected in our education, particularly, it's not reflected in our films or in our books. There aren't a huge number of films and books about this subject. But it is changing, to go back to your question. It is now on the national curriculum, although it's not a prominent part of it. We still would rather talk about Henry VIII and World War One and World War Two. But there's a lot of campaigns to teach this history, not least because it explains why we're a multicultural country. It largely explains why I'm here talking to you today. And yet, I was never taught this. I went to a very racially diverse school. At no point, every time we had a Remembrance Day service for World War One and World War Two, at no point was it ever mentioned that millions of Africans and Asians and Sikhs like me had fought for the colonizing country. It just wasn't mentioned. It's a really bizarre aspect of British culture.
Yeah, I mean, this is strange. I mean, when you walk around England or other parts of the UK, I mean, it does seem to an outsider that it is probably the most multi-ethnic, multi-racial melting pot in all of Europe. I mean, when you go to France, obviously there are lots of Black Africans and North Africans, but they don't seem quite as integrated into the culture as they are in England. I mean, do you think that this discussion of empire, I mean, it sorts itself into these camps? I mean, you said it's very, very difficult to have a balanced view of empire. Why is it that people feel compelled to assess it in some normative way, right? What you call the balance sheet view, right?
Yeah.
I mean, is it, do we have to kind of, I mean, to some degree, apply some balance sheet perspective? I mean, we have to weigh up the pros and cons. I mean, and if we do, why is it so difficult to do so in a balanced way?
I would say balance is not a very useful concept for history in general. I think nuance is what you want to aim for. But the reason I think we've always just struggled to talk about British Empire, except in this way of trying to balance the positives against the negatives, is because this is how empire was discussed at the time. In the 19th century, there are endless arguments about whether we should hold on to our empire, whether we were making money out of it overall, whether overall it was a good thing or a bad thing. And this continues to be the way we discuss empire. We continue trying to weigh the miles of railway we built in India against the millions of lives that were lost in the potato famine in Ireland. It's an absurd way of trying to understand history, because how do you balance railways against deaths? And how do you balance slavery against anti-slavery? And I guess my ultimate conclusion after 5 years of studying this is that you can't come down on any side. It was a fundamentally contradictory phenomenon. It resulted in democracy in large parts of the world, in Canada and Australia and New Zealand. But it also created massive instability in places like Nigeria, Pakistan, Sudan, and so on. It was involved in slavery. It was also involved in anti-slavery. It destroyed the environment in large parts of the world. But then it led to the birth of, conservation and environmentalism. It set up the free press in parts of the world, and then it spread press censorship. So it's fundamentally a contradictory thing. And if someone is telling you that overall it was good or overall it was bad, I think you're probably listening to quite a dodgy person.
Well, do you think that people are more comfortable with nuance in journalism than they are with history? I mean, it seems like nuance is hard to find, anywhere.
Yeah, no, and it's getting worse because obviously social media is now just setting people up against each other all the time. And politics is becoming highly polarized. Everything is turning into a football match where you have your side and the other side are evil, right? And history, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, trying to understand imperial history through that prism, it's like saying, I want to understand the history of the climate, but I'm only going to study the sunshine, or I'm only going to study the rain. It's not going to give you a very sophisticated sense of the climate, is it? You want to study the weather in between. And that is the same is true for history.
But why? What are the stakes? I mean, nobody really gets too excited about whether the Normans or the Saxons, were the good guys or the bad guys. I mean, it's even though some of these colonial events happened a long time ago, I mean, we still have something invested in these stories now. I mean, many of them are feel quite current once you are exposed to them. I mean, I was thinking in particular of this, the Jallianwala Bagh incident, which you documented and which I knew very little about before I encountered it in your book. I mean, this was 100 years ago or so. For some people, that might seem like the distant past. I mean, for me, that seems pretty darn recent.
Yeah, that is the thing. I mean, this is not ancient history. And also, I think you need to understand this history to understand the modern world. I mean, a lot of news events, like, for example, Israel-Palestine, that is a situation the British Empire largely created during the British Mandate, where the British simultaneously promised that part of the world to the Zionist Jews and to the Arabs in this kind of unprofessional correspondence, thereby creating the conditions for the war that you have today. You got issues in Myanmar. You got the bombing of Yemen. We're bombing Yemen at the moment, and guess what? We were doing pretty much the same thing about 120 years ago. You got the instability in Kashmir, which is a situation we created by selling that part of the world to this tyrannical Hindu monarch. But also like daily things on a more benign way, daily things about our lives, like the fact that Indians drink tea and British people drink tea, the existence of rum, the existence of entire nations like Nigeria and Pakistan. These wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the British Empire. And not least the USA. I mean, I would say, we've been talking about the denialism of Britain when it comes to empire. I would say there's a huge amount of denialism in America about the fact that it was created by the British Empire. The Americans love to believe that they are anti-imperial, and this is my theory as to why every evil German in any Hollywood movie is played by a British person. They like to see themselves opposed to the British Empire, but actually the 13 colonies were a distinct phase of seminal phase of American history, and the culture of the Puritans arguably defined the culture of America. With the emphasis on legal rights and property and so on. And I would argue America is the ultimate British imperial legacy.
Well, I mean, it seems like, I don't know, people find it difficult to have some kind of mongrel identity. I mean, you talked about how, Modi is launching the real independence movement in India, trying to shed its English past. I mean, it's impossible, right? I mean, there's no way that they could get rid of any English influence on India. Yeah, they could change some names and, they could try to reduce the role of the English language in India. But I mean, there's no way that you could kind of rip yourself free of everything that England did in India, right?
Yeah, I think you can't decolonize the world really, because you'll have to undo fundamentally the structure of the world. But I mean, some of the decolonization efforts in India are really worthwhile. I think changing names of certain cities, and also building a new parliament at the cost of $1.8 billion right next door to the British one, just because they don't want to do democracy anymore in an imperial parliament. I can see the reasoning behind that, but I don't see Modi saying, you know what, we're going to stop playing cricket. I'd like to see him try to do that, because it's such a central part of Indian culture, and the way people dress, the way people talk, even the food has been influenced by Britain in some ways. You can get a good chicken tikka masala in Delhi, which is a dish created by Indian migrants to Britain. Then they brought it back to India. So Also, the fact that Indians drive on the left, that's something that goes back to the British Empire too.
Well, do you think that in the former colonies, you're also seeing this devolution into a football match where, people are Team England or Team anti-England?
It's much more complex. Interestingly, when it comes to India and Modi, he pitches himself as an anti-imperialist and anti-British, but at the same time, he talks about, I think, 2,000 years of the slave mentality, and he merges the Mughal Empire with the British Empire. So for him, decolonization is a way for him to be Islamophobic, So it's not a binary. And I've got to say, I traveled to so many countries for my last book, former imperial territories like Mauritius and Nigeria. And yeah, you do get a lot of anti-imperial feeling, but also you get a lot of people saying the British aren't the problem. Our problem are our modern corrupt politicians. They've had plenty of time to sort things out, for example, in Nigeria, and they haven't. So you don't get such a binary feeling as you do about the history as you do in Britain, I think.
Yeah, the case of the Sikhs is particularly interesting. The slaughter that you're talking about, it happened in 1919. This was incredibly vicious and violent towards the Sikh population. But it seems like, the Sikhs are in many ways proud of their association with the British in some ways, right?
Yeah. This is where ultimate example of nuance. So the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre, if you've seen Gandhi the movie, you will have seen it depicted. Sikhs were the victims, but there were Muslims and Hindus there in large numbers too. But also there were Sikhs amongst the shooters, because the British had recruited the Sikhs en masse after the 1857 mutiny, because the Sikhs had taken their side, largely, not entirely. And then the British fetishized us as this kind of martial race. We weren't the only people they fetishized in this way. They also fetishized the Scottish Highlanders, the Gurkhas of Nepal, and they decided we were this military race. And nowadays, Sikhs see themselves pretty much as a military race, even though there's no such thing. No one is born to be military. Some of that comes down to the fact that our origins are in that culture. Our gurus were quite militaristic, but the British supercharged it, and there was a huge growth in Sikhism after the British fetishized us, because it was in people's benefit to be Sikh. So this is quite an odd thing. As a British Sikh, so many parts of my identity have been created by British imperialists, and I had no idea until about 4 years ago. But it's so powerful that we even see ourselves through the prism of this racial science of the 19th century.
Now, I think a lot of British people would say that they're not racist, and they would say that the empire was not racist. To what extent is there some value in that myth, right? it's clearly a myth, but do myths play some role as aspirations? Like, is it some way more likely to become true if one believes it's true? If someone believes that it's deeply rooted in their culture and in their legal system, in other words, is it a good thing to fake it till you make it?
I think it's a good thing to have nuance. Also, it's a really good thing to be able to cope with the idea that opposite things can be true at the same time. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to race, Britain is a massive contradiction, because I do think we are the most successful multicultural society in the world. We've come a long way, even in my lifetime. At the same time, we created a lot of modern racism that we then exported around the world. Some of it to America. Racial science, when it emerged in the 19th century, had a distinct British flavor. All those weird racial scientists with their weird ideas. They went to America and it became something else in America. They went to Germany, and we all know what happened there. But the British played a huge role in that. And you said, people might disagree about whether the British Empire was racist or not. I don't think the specialists would not disagree. Every single serious imperial historian I've ever read would accept that the British Empire was racist. It was part of the ideology. And you see it in that poem by Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling, probably our most famous cultural imperialist, wrote a poem called White Man's Burden, which nowadays is not, it's not read really. I suspect Boris Johnson is a big fan of the poem. But that poem was written to Theodore Roosevelt as a way to inspire him and America to do in the Philippines what Britain had done in India and elsewhere, to take up the white man's burden, to teach the uncivilized people how to be. And that is the nature of the racism of the British Empire. Not only was it racist, it then exported it to large parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also reference kind of the ways in which the Germans have reckoned with their more recent past and really integrated it into their public life, this confrontation with the Nazi regime. I mean, should we think of that as a model for American and British history? What can we learn from that?
Yeah, there's a great book called Learning from the Germans, which argues that Americans should do what the Germans do, which is, when it comes to their World War II history, they constantly confront it in their art and their films, in their infrastructure. You'll be walking down a road in Berlin and you'll see these stumblestones, which will tell you from which Jewish people were kidnapped from their homes, on which house, on which date. They paid reparations. They're really good at facing up to this history. And, the Americans could learn from that, and the British definitely could. But I would argue that when it comes to Germany's own imperial history, it's not particularly good. They've paid reparations, so they're better than us. But they aren't as good as facing up to that dark history. And actually, there are a huge number of European colonizing powers that are particularly great. A lot of them are quite nostalgic. There was a survey done recently which found that actually the British aren't the most nostalgic about their empire. There's one country more nostalgic than the British. Can you guess?
It's Holland, right?
Yeah, it's right. The Netherlands, the Dutch. And you can see why, because it's a tiny country. And it was ahead of the British. So the British East India Company was a copy of the Dutch East Indies Company. But also then you've got Russia, which is so nostalgic about its empire. It's invaded Ukraine. So this is not a problem exclusive to the British.
Well, I think that the Belgians have had to have a bit of a reckoning in the last couple of years, right?
Yeah, I mean, often Belgium is used as a way to stop any discussion of the British, because quite often I get asked.
There's always somebody worse, right?
Yeah, why don't you talk about the Belgians instead? Because they're worse. And this was being said in the 19th century. And yeah, they were absolutely appalling. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss our empire. It's not a zero-sum game.
Well, look, I remember back in I guess it was the 80s or 70s, you'd read these accounts of Paki bashing, right? And I think, of course, Paki bashing included not just Pakistanis, right? But, pretty much anybody who had, dark skin. And it particularly, I think it was big in the Midlands, right, where you're from. And you don't hear about that much. I mean, you also don't hear about soccer hooligans all that much. Yeah. I mean, what has changed? I mean, the Windrush generation. I mean, those are some terrible stories. But what's changed? What accounts for the changes to the extent that we've seen changes in England in the last 30, 40 years?
I would say there has been a lot of positive change, and actually thinking about the issue through the prism of my local football team is a good way of looking at it. Wolverhampton Wanderers, you won't have heard of it, but is the finest football team in the world. But in the 1970s, when I was growing up, the fans were famous for wearing KKK hoods to football matches. I wasn't allowed out of the house when they were playing because they were so synonymous with racial violence, right? But now, they've got massive support from the local Black and Asian community. We recently had a captain, a player who was half Punjabi, half English. It's changed a lot, and I've seen at games people be racist and people being thrown out for it. But equally, I also saw a football commentator a couple of years ago getting monkey chants, a black football commentator having monkey chants directed at him, and the person concerned being taken to court. So it remains a problem. Racism and racist violence is still a thing in Britain, but it's definitely not the 70s, where, Paki bashing, one judge famously said that it was a sport. It was what people did on a weekend, But I think there's a degree of amnesia about the racial violence that there was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And we almost act like it never happened. But it really, really did happen. And it was a definite extension of what happened in Empire. You know, the way in which brown people had been dealt with in Empire, and even the Jallianwala Bagh massacre became the way in which they were dealt with in the 1950s in London and beyond in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a trained historian, and so I like to think that this trend, this positive trend, to the extent that there's positive trend, is due in part to a reckoning with history. But my more realistic self tells me that, it probably is completely independent of, what we know of and how we think of history. I mean, do you think that there is a relationship? Do you think that our understanding of the past and our awareness of the past does influence the kind of general sentiment? And it could go in either way, right? So an awareness of the violence and of the brutality could lead us to become more humane. But similarly, a whitewashing of the past and a belief that everything is wonderful and that we're wonderful as English people, could also lead to improvement. I mean, how much do you think these positive trends can be driven by an awareness and an engagement with the past?
I think history does play a role. I'm thinking back to like when I was at school on the BBC. I remember an interview with a racist comedian, Bernard Manning, in I think it was 1997, and he famously said, there were no Pakis at Dunkirk, and Pakis is a racially abusive word for Asian people, Indians, and he was technically right in that Pakistan did not exist during World War II. It was created afterwards, right? It was British India then, but there were British Indians at Dunkirk and during World War One and World War Two. And whenever anyone makes that kind of sentiment now, and it does happen, people argue, black and Asian people didn't play a role during World War One and World War Two. They generally get shouted down now. They're treated as idiots. So I think history on that issue has helped people understand. But I still think people are not aware that most black and Asian people arrived in this country as citizens. I mean, they're so unaware that during the Windrush scandal we've had in this country, we deported British citizens, people who came as British citizens to countries they did not know. And if you read the report on this scandal, one of its conclusions is we need to teach our civil servants basic history because they don't know, which is why they were deporting these people. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, I think what a lot of people find puzzling, including myself, is the extent to which some of these people who were brutal and racist actually took a deep interest in the culture of the people that they were oppressing, right? I mean, Hastings famously, was fluent in, I think, Persian and Urdu and Bengali, right? Even Enoch Powell, right? Comes from your part of your neck of the woods. I mean, this guy studied Urdu, and he said he fell in love with India. It seems hard to understand how people could have a deep understanding of other cultures and yet be so racist.
Well, you got to realize that, the Enlightenment, at the heart of the Enlightenment, was some profound racism. I mean, if you go back to this, Enlightenment, obviously something we all believe in, the idea that human beings could be classified as being greater or worse than others. It was there right at the beginning. And, you had the idea of the noble savage, which was prevalent in America. If you look at the story of the way Disney tells the story of Pocahontas. Yeah, and that is something that seems to be benign, but is infected with racism, right? So you just can't escape it. And I would say, though, broadly, what happened is that when the British went to India, initially they weren't massively racist. They were a huge number of men, British men who went over there, had Indian wives, left money for children who they had with his Indian wives. But it all changed after 1857, after the Indian Mutiny, with Victorian attitudes and the arrival of racial science. Suddenly it became us and them, and it became argued that the British were superior, and attitudes became much more toxic and racist.
Yeah, I mean, there's this one character in, I forget which book, that was I guess a plantation owner in Jamaica who was absolutely brutal to his slaves, but he had a black wife, and he was very enlightened and cultured and literate. I mean, even at the individual level, there's so much complexity and contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I don't like to make comparisons between British Empire and Hitler and the Nazism because I think they were different phenomenons. But in terms of the psychology, you saw it with Nazis who could be incredibly sophisticated.
Yeah, I think you called
And
it compartmentalization, right?
yeah, human psychology is capable of that, where you can separate two things. And yeah, I think you're talking about Thomas Thistlewood, probably the most sadistic slave owner we know of in history. He was raping, torturing people on a daily basis, but then getting these deliveries of these very sophisticated Enlightenment books and having sophisticated discussions and debates in letters and so on. And yeah, it's hard to imagine.
Mhm. Well, of course, most of your work is about the people, but you also have some other interesting insights about the material world. And I found that chapter on Kew Gardens and the dissemination of all these different forms of trees and bushes and plants. I mean, that was fascinating. And these boxes, right? You said that this was perhaps one of the most influential inventions ever. I forget what they were called, but these boxes that they used
The Wardian
to
box.
transport.
Wardian case.
Yeah.
The Wardian case, yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible, yeah. The
this
Wardian
is-
case is like this thing that was accidentally invented. People found a way to transport plants. Basically, it's like a mini greenhouse. But that box transformed the plants of the world. And actually, a lot of common British garden plants now came from America and around the world, like rhododendrons and azaleas and so on, because it suddenly became possible to transport plants. But we don't see plants as technology nowadays. But they were a central part of imperial technology, and they were central in the colonization of the world and in making money out of empire. So when it came to something like tea and building tea plantations, and making tea a central part of the diet, not only in India, but in Britain. But then also you've got cinchona, which is this incredible, bark of a tree, which contains quinine. And it's the quinine in that stopped white people dying in huge numbers in Africa. So because of that plant, because the British created all these plantations, they could suddenly colonize large parts of Africa. All the Europeans could. So it was a plant that made the colonization of Africa possible. Before that, I think a place like Mali in the late 19th century, if you went there, you had a 300% chance of mortality, which meant you would die within 3 or 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
But after quinine, you could actually live there.
Yeah, I think I read that the life expectancy of a typical employee of the Royal African Company was 3 years. And that's presumably if they stayed offshore, right? And never set foot on the continent. But, I remember reading about how the plans for the textile mills that later showed up in Massachusetts were smuggled out inside the brain of an engineer from from Manchester. But it seems like plants, the same thing happened with plants, right? People would, these things were intellectual property, more or less, like the nutmeg plants on Run, or, rubber, and, there were some other plants that people tried to keep them as, and even, I guess it was the quinine, right? That was
cinchona.
That when the British would figure out a way to, get them away from their native territory, then they would relocate them in completely different places.
Yeah, I mean, the British and the Dutch spent decades trying to work out how to grow cinchona. It took them such a long time, and they made massive, expensive mistakes. But rubber as well, and we just don't think about rubber now, but rubber was one of the main reasons why the British wanted to hold on to Malaya. They wanted to hold on to it so much. It was so profitable that it led to one of the darkest wars in the history of the British Empire, the so-called 1948 Malayan Emergency. And I love the fact that it was called the Malayan Emergency and not a war for insurance reasons, because if they called it a war, the insurers wouldn't have paid out. But
that might explain why the Russians are calling it a special operation. I didn't think there might be an insurance reason for that.
yeah, exactly. Euphemisms also, it makes people not realize. And actually, it's one of the main reasons no one talks about the Malayan Emergency. It's because doesn't sound that bad, does it? But actually, it was utterly awful. And it's one of those examples of where people there remember it very well. The British are totally clueless. So they turn up, not realizing the extent of feeling and embarrass themselves.
Well, the other thing you cover in the most recent book is the phenomenon of indentured servitude. And, I think a lot of us have been encountered the history of slavery a lot recently. But, indentured servitude was a phenomenon that was perhaps almost as big, both before and after and during the time of slavery.
Yeah, one of the main reasons you see Indians wherever you go in the world is because of the British. Because after they abolished slavery, they realized they needed workers, and they didn't seem willing to, incentivize the formerly enslaved to do the work. So they decided to send 1 million Indians around the world to places like Mauritius, Trinidad, Jamaica, Guyana, to do the work that the enslaved formerly did. And often they were treated as badly as the enslaved. Not quite as badly, but pretty badly. But this led to all sorts of phenomenon, like ganja, for example. I don't know if you are aware of ganja in America in the way we are. It's synonymous with Jamaican culture. Marijuana, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, it was an Indian crop introduced by Indian laborers, and it's an Indian word. If you think about it, it sounds like it is an Indian word. And and so all these phenomena exist around the world. And the way in which the British Empire changed the demographics of the planet, I don't think we think about that enough. All the Irish that ended up in America because of an imperial catastrophe, the Great Potato Famine.
Those are my ancestors.
Exactly. You wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the incompetence of British imperial policy, right? But also you've got the 3 million slaves, you've got the 5% of British people who emigrated in the first 14 years of the 20th century. And that's another reason why you see British people everywhere you go in the world. You've got the 15 million people displaced as a result of partition. The British fundamentally changed the demographics of the planet.
Yeah, no, and if you zoom out, it's hard to imagine any historical event that was as impactful, right? If you go back to the Romans, the Romans are probably the closest thing to it, but it took them a whole lot longer, and their impact geographically was a whole lot smaller. If you take impact and divide it by year in human history, the British Empire seems to have been the most impactful thing.
Yeah, and then you add to that the economic sides of it, the intellectual sides, the racism. It's a pretty profound legacy, isn't it? It's pretty profound.
Well, I think you talk about the role of the Commonwealth, which is kind of a curious organization, doesn't seem to know what it exists for, right? And you say, well, maybe there is a place for the Commonwealth. And I think a lot of the people who supported Brexit thought that this organization could be rehabilitated and that England could create some entity which could potentially be at the same level as the EU and the US. And I think that when the Commonwealth was first created, that was the idea. The idea was that somehow they could keep up with the US in terms of their global importance. Do you think that, has Brexit led in any way to a reconceptualization of what it means to be British? Has the Commonwealth become an idea that is more salient for most British people in the last couple of years?
I think the empire and feelings about empire played a role in Brexit, absolutely. It wasn't the only thing, but definitely. I think on a fundamental level, because we'd run a quarter of the world, being the member of a membership organization felt like a demotion to lots of British people. where we had to go along and decide things by consensus rather than just pushing people around. And I think there was hope that the Commonwealth could provide an answer. But the problem with the Commonwealth is that it's never really meant anything. I mean, famously, when Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, was trying to persuade his cabinet colleagues to join the Commonwealth, he did so arguing that it didn't matter anyway. So why not join it? Because it was nothing. And it continues to be nothing. But I think it could be something on the grounds that you've got a bunch of countries who want to talk about the issues we've been discussing and reparations and imperial legacies. They are united by this history. And you've got a royal family who are increasingly, I think, engaged in these issues. And you've got a country like Britain who need to get engaged with these issues. So why not combine it all? And why can't it become a kind of a truth and reconciliation committee? I can't see it happening anytime soon. But in theory, it could serve a role.
Well, Commonwealth aside, I mean, the Anglophone world does have a certain coherence to it. I mean, you look at the Booker Awards. I mean, all of us who are native English speakers and who are literary, I mean, we read books by authors from India, right, from parts of Africa, from the Caribbean, from Pakistan. I mean, is the Anglophone world in some ways a coherent cultural entity?
Yeah, although the Booker Prize was confused recently by the fact that now American writers can win it. And
we're colony too.
Yeah, but when you feel like it, you'll talk about how you're a colony, but then most of the time you don't. I don't see America's, but I think America has got such a strong culture of its own, and I think there is a Commonwealth culture where, and you see this when you go to India and Nigeria and so on, mainly through the education systems. Yeah. A lot of which was set up during the days of imperialism. I was shocked to find schools in Nigeria still teaching the kind of curriculum that was being taught in the 1950s. And then you get this peculiar phenomenon where people like Kemi Badenoch, who is a former conservative minister, who went to school in Nigeria, coming back to Britain and saying, oh, Nigerians love the empire. And I thought an empire is great because she's had that antiquated imperial education. Mm-hmm. It's crazy the way it all works. And you've got the most vibrant churches in London at the moment are Nigerian churches. So we went over there, converted loads of people to Christianity, lost interest in Christianity ourselves, and now they've come back and they're trying to convert us back to this religion we no longer have interest in. So it works in such complicated ways, doesn't it?
Well, in addition to education, I mean, it seems like there's also the notion of a jurisprudence or a legal system that is shared, perhaps more in the letter than in practice. If you've ever encountered the Indian legal system, it's not, I guess, the most efficient system, but at least on paper there are these similarities. I was in Dubai recently, and I was at the Dubai International Finance Center, and I saw judges, with white wigs.
Yeah, that's a real legacy, isn't it?
And they have in Nigeria, right? They have, judges with white wigs, and you're like, what the heck? I mean, you got lice down here? What's going on with the wigs? I don't get it. But that does seem to also be a lasting impact of empire.
Totally. And so many countries took on the Westminster Constitution as their political system. Even today, there's something called the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. It sits in, I think, near the Supreme Court in Britain. 26 countries still have that as their final court of appeal. And a lot of people argue that Britain spread the rule of law to large parts of the world, and that is contentious. I think they tried. They absolutely tried. And one of my favorite figures from this is Virginia Woolf's grandfather, James Stephen, who was this very earnest man who worked hard to introduce fairness into the British Empire from London. He was very, very religious. He only ever worked once on the Sabbath, and that was to sign an abolition bill. He once had a cigar, and he liked it. And because he liked it, he never had a cigar ever again. And he worked very hard to introduce the rule of law. The problem is that people on the ground didn't want the rule of law often. So you had this famous example in London of the Ilbert Bill crisis, when it was decided that, Indians and British people in India would go through the same justice system, but the white community there rebelled, and it never happened. So you've got there the urge to introduce the rule of law against the racism of empire, and it didn't really happen. But I can see why people think it's a thing, because very high up people in the British Empire, like Warren Hastings and the Clive of India, were dragged in front of Parliament and had to were held accountable for their crimes. But they got away with it. So I think there definitely was an urge to be fair, but often it didn't work out.
One of the facts that I noticed recently is that of all the ethnic groups in England, the one that is least wealthy are the whites. And now, of course, this is primarily due to the fact that London is richer than the rest of the country, and London is the most multi-ethnic. But do you think that there is, despite the recent electoral triumphs, do you think there is an element within England that is, resistant to the multi-ethnic nature of New England? And does this in some ways pose a threat, or is it more or less just something that's going to fade away?
There's definitely a new racism in our politics, but at the same time there's a deeper and deeper understanding and a higher sophistication in our understanding of racial politics. So, for example, you mentioned certain white groups in London being very poor. Let's look at the Asians. So British Asians used to be all grouped together as one group. But now you have British Hindus, who are one of the most successful groups economically in Britain. But you also got British Muslims, British Bangladeshis, who are one of the least successful groups in Britain. But I think people understand that. People think they understand the fact that Rishi Sunak was our Prime Minister. He's British Hindu. He went to a private school. He was very privileged. He's going to go work in Silicon Valley probably in a few months' time. And his community are doing very well. And they probably understand that Bangladeshi Muslims and certain white communities are. I think we're becoming much more sophisticated in our understanding of this. But at the same time, there are politicians trying to exploit with very selective knowledge, saying, oh, some white groups are doing very badly, so therefore, blah, 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 And so we've got to, as writers and historians, always argue for sophistication. Politicians will always try to simplify things.
Mm-hmm. And within the Commonwealth countries, there are these moves to get away from English culture, Modi in particular, and the movements for reparation. Are those, do you think, also examples of, last-ditch resistance that ultimately will also fail?
I feel very positive about reparation. When you say the word reparations in Britain, people clutch their pearls and think, "Oh my God," And I understand some of it is ridiculous because there was a report recently which said that Britain owes 777 trillion or something like that to the Caribbean. That's not going to happen. We already don't have much money, right? But I would argue at the same time we have started down the road. I would argue that the Good Friday Agreement was a process of truth and reconciliation in Ireland. There was reparations paid. A huge amount of money was put in to help people. There were apologies. There was an official apology for the Great Potato Famine, an imperial catastrophe. There was an apology for Bloody Sunday. And I would argue after that long process, we now have a healthier relationship with Ireland. I would say something similar happened in Kenya. We were dragged to court by the Mau Mau victims, and it wasn't something Britain did willingly. But as a result of that court case, we had to pay out $20 million. I would say that was reparations. The Foreign Secretary at the time, William Hague, made an apology. And I would say now we have a healthy relationship with Kenya. There was a recent royal visit there, which was the sanest royal tour of my lifetime, where King Charles went and talked to the victims and talked about the massacres, and it was sane. So I think we've begun down the road. We just don't realize we're doing it, and we've just got to do it with about 54 more countries.
Well, there's a scene in one of your books where you described how you went to the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, and you yourself were a character in the parade, I guess. I mean, what was that like? I mean, have you become sort of a I don't know, a hometown hero in the Birmingham area?
Well, I'm from Wolverhampton, and it's not hard to become a hometown hero in Wolverhampton. There aren't many of us, but yeah, it's nice, but it's also awkward because Wolverhampton is one of the most multicultural towns in Britain, and it's a success story, I would say. But at the same time, there's a history of racism there that people don't want to hear about, and so I guess I've also become. Some people see me as someone who's always trying to create problems. I mean, there's an idea now, you've probably seen it on Twitter and elsewhere, where anyone who ever talks about racism is accused of being a racist themselves. I think you saw it with Elon Musk saying that DEI is the new racism. And so to just talk about race is to be ridiculed and trolled half to death. So I find myself in an awkward position where, in some ways, I'm celebrated by some people as a sign of multiculturalism having worked, but also demonized as someone who is not enabling Britain to become racially free.
Well, I mean, you said that some of these folks who are, I guess, called woke are doing more harm than good by, I guess, tearing down statues. You suggest maybe that we should have an annual tomato throwing event as maybe a way that's less likely to inspire reaction. But I mean, when you walk around the world and you see statues, I mean, it's hard to find a statue of anybody who wasn't in some ways a killer, right?
I mean,
some kind.
The thing about statues is that it's just an issue that doesn't matter that much because they're just street furniture. We didn't really notice statues until Black Lives Matter, right? They've been standing there forever, and I think there's a disproportionate amount of attention. And if you do begin tearing them down, I think you then face the accusation of trying to delete history and blah. You just play to the culture warriors. And I think it's much more interesting when you turn them into scenes of art, Like the statue that was torn down in Bristol of a slave trader called Colston is now in a museum. It's a really interesting piece of art. And if you had one day where you pelted the statues you don't like with tomatoes, at least then you can't be accused of deleting history. But then you get the food waste people who will be on your case, being very cross, I guess.
Now, here in the U.S., if you go to, say, Monticello now, I mean, it took a while, but if you go there, you will hear and see discussions of the slave life at Monticello. And I think you said that if you go visit one of these national historic homes in England that may have been built on the slave trade, you typically don't see any mention or reference to slavery. Is that something that's changing?
Actually, I've been to that house in America. I did a tour of former slave plantations in America. I've toured houses in Britain with slave histories and also toured former plantations in the Caribbean. And all of those, the worst is actually the Caribbean, which I was shocked to find in 3 houses in a row, slavery barely mentioned. And I ended up talking to one of the tour guides, a young black man, and he was even more annoyed than me. And he said it was deleted or censored because British tourists didn't want their holiday ruined with talk of slavery. They wanted to go to the buffet. They wanted to go on the rum tour. They wanted to marvel at the achievements of their white ancestors in building these Jacobean houses in the Caribbean. They didn't want to talk about the history, which I found deeply depressing. So things are changing in America?
I think so, yeah, for sure. I mean, like Monticello, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, and Mount Vernon, we definitely have seen changes in how they depict the life on those places. So hopefully that will spread to these other parts of the world. Sathnam, thanks so much for joining me. These books are wonderful, Empireland and Empireworld, and they really, hopefully you'll release a boxed version with both of them together so you can get the bundle discount. But also, don't forget Boy with the Top Knot. Thanks so much. Talk again soon.
Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.